in a nutshell about literature with Joseph Pearce.
Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. I am Jan Franczak and this is In a Nutshell about literature with Joseph Pearce. So far you've been able to see the first five short parts. However, if you haven't seen them yet, or if you prefer to see them in one long video, you can do it right now. At the moment, this series is available in 3 languages, in English on rumble.com and in English with Polish and thanks to Gilmar Siqueira, Spanish subtitles on YouTube. We would like to provide even more languages if possible. Everything depends on your support. If you would like to support the development of this channel financially, and especially the development and translation of In a Nutshell about literature with Joseph Pearce, please find the information on how to do it below the video. I hope you enjoy the following conversation. Joseph, thank you for accepting my invitation to talk about literature. And I would like to start with something really basic. Why should we read books? Why should we read literature? We have movies, we have TV serials, we have the internet, YouTube. Why bother?
That's a good question. The first, in the broadest sense of the word, books enable us to escape from virtual reality into reality. And I think that we want to actually live our lives as far as possible in the fullness of reality. And that means we have to unplug ourselves, to disconnect from technology, where people are channeling information to us, and put ourselves in control. And that can mean going out into the garden and watching the birds. It can be watching the sunset. It can be building a bonfire. But it also could and should include the reading of books, and preferably not books on a screen, but books where you actually turn the pages and you have a tactile, incarnational experience with the person, the author of the book, that does not have technology as the intermediary.
So you think that, for example, reading an e-book on, I don't know, e-book reader is not a good idea?
I'm not saying people shouldn't do it. I think there's a hierarchy of preference here. And as I've said, that if we should not be living the whole of our lives connected to the internet or connected to technology, plugged in, shall we say, we should disconnect so that we can reconnect to reality itself, to the real thing and not the virtual thing. So that means that, if we're already spending most of our working day, as many of us are, plugged into a computer, then why would we want to spend our downtime, our own time, as plugged into the computer, which means we're basically plugged into technology from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed. That cannot be good for us psychologically. It cannot be good for us spiritually. I really think that we need to disconnect so that we can reconnect to reality itself, and ultimately the reality itself is reality himself. Which is Jesus Christ, God himself, in his incarnational presence. So if we're living in virtual reality, not reality, we are disconnecting ourselves from these deepest aspects of reality itself. And I think that's dangerous. Many of us spend so much time with our gadgets that they've become godgets. We idolize and worship and spend much more time in our gadgets than we do with our God. We need to not be doing that.
And to be more specific, why should we read poetry? On the one hand side, it seems to me that poetry, it is still something that probably young people do. They write poetry when they are in love and so on and so on. But on the other hand side, I think that in our times, poetry is not widely read because I suppose it is not understood, and people generally don't read poetry. Critics in popular magazines don't write reviews of poetry. There are no special columns where you can send your poetry to be judged. So why should we read poetry?
Say that the magazine that I've edited for 23 years is an exception to that rule. We publish original contemporary poetry in every issue. I think the key thing about poetry is that it forces us to slow down. Poetry cannot be read at speed. So we have to slow down in order to actually engage with it. That's one of the reasons that's not very popular these days, because people are always in a hurry. They never have time for anything except the superficial, and they have to do that at speed. And so something requires them slowing down, concentrating. So it is actually very, very good for them. Over and above the quality of the poetry itself. I mean, poetry as poetry has that power to slow us down and to reconnect us to real time, by the way, because moving at the speed of light is not real time for human beings. We are actually meant to take our time. There's only two things we can do with life. We can't make time. As the great poet Gerard Manley Hopkins said, we are soft sift in an hourglass. In other words, that each of us has our own hourglass with the sands of time passing through it. We don't know how much sand we will have an individual one. We don't have the same amount of sand, and we don't know how much sand we have left. But one thing we do know is it's sifting through, and in the end we'll have no more left, and that will be the end of our time on Earth. We are soft sift in an hourglass. So when we bear that in mind, it's very important for us to be spending our time well, and we can't make time. So there's only two things we can do with time: the time that we have before we die. We can either take it or we can waste it. So time spent with poetry is time taken. Time spent in an unnecessary haste in pursuit of trivia is time wasted. And when we die, I would suggest we don't want our maker to say, well, most of your time you just wasted away. What were you doing? You weren't doing anything except wasting the time you had. So I think we need to be taking time. And I think reading good poetry, which is the distillation of language, it is to language, the language of words, what great classical music is to music. It's the greatest poetry is the greatest use of language, and we want to be engaging with that beauty. First of all, in terms of the form itself, which is beautiful, but then with the greatest poets, with what they're doing with the form, what they're saying with the form, what they're teaching us physically and metaphysically about the cosmos and about ourselves.
Then maybe one question more about poetry. Is poetry, would you say that is poetry always difficult for people at the same time that poetry is created? Because, as I said, nowadays it seems that people don't understand poetry. Why is that?
I think that most of us spend, it's a new acronym, ADD, attention deficit disorder, where these days none of us have the ability to concentrate on any one thing for any length of time. And I think that is a consequence of being plugged in and living a life of distraction rather than attraction. So we're meant to be attracted to the good, true, and beautiful, not distracted from the good, the true, and the beautiful by pursuing trivia at speed and in short spurts. We need to be able to spend time on the things worth spending time with. Time in prayer and time in praise, just by looking at a sunset, but also time in poetry and actually engaging with the beauty of the language. You know, the other thing is very important. If I, you know, the Anglo-Saxons talk about each individual having their own unique word hoard. In other words, a bag of words that they carry around with them. And every new word that we learn is real wealth, because we need words to communicate the cosmos to ourselves, first of all, to be able to see something and know what it is and to make sense of it and see how it relates to other things. We need to know what things are called in order to engage reality with ourselves, and then we need to have those same words to communicate that understanding reality to others. So an increase in vocabulary, an increase in the size of our word hoard, of our unique bag of words which we carry around with us, enables us to understand the cosmos and ourselves and others much more clearly, which is why reading great poets, such as, for instance, Shakespeare, enables us to increase the size of our vocabulary, increase the size of our word hoard, and this enables us to understand the reality in which we find ourselves much more clearly. So it's, you know, apart from aesthetics and a purely pragmatic, practical sense, if you want to understand the world in which you live, you have to have a vocabulary that allows you to do it, and the best way of learning that is by reading the great poets, the great writers who have this rich vocabulary, which when we read them, they're sharing that with us and communicating that to us, and in fact giving it to us, because when we learn a new word, it becomes a gift which we have in our own word hoards.
Let's go to reading novels and short stories, if we can put it together. Why should we read novels?
Okay, well, there are, I sometimes talk about the fact that three classical understandings of who we are anthropos, from the Greek word for man, he who turns up in wonder; homo viator, man on a journey, or man on a quest, or man on a pilgrimage; and homo superbus, proud man, who refuses the quest, who refuses to go on the journey, who goes his own way instead. Now, this is who we are. So what we need to do is be able to understand who we are in the terms of who we are. So anthropos is he who, according to Plato, he who turns up in wonder. So great poetry allows us to do that. As Samwise Gamgee says in The Lord of the Rings, above all shadows rides the sun. Well, if you don't look up, you don't know that. You don't know that above all darkness there is a light which supersedes all evil. There's a goodness that supersedes it, unless you look up. So great poetry allows us to do that. The great stories, so novels or short stories, narratives, allow us to understand who we are in terms of homo viator, that we're called, each of our lives is a journey, and homo viator, if each of our lives is a journey, it's therefore ipso facto a story, right? Because a journey, life journey is a life story. So each of us is living in our own story in relation to other people who are also living their own stories, and we are in each other's story. So what stories fictional stories enable us to do is to see our own story reflected to us in a mirror, which maybe can take us deeper into an understanding of ourselves. So as Tolkien says about fairy stories, in particular stories in general, is that they hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. So that's the importance of it. And because homo viator, the man on the journey, stories also show us homo superbus, the wicked, the evil, who go their own way and refuse the appointed journey and cause chaos and destruction and ultimately self-destruction in consequence.
So they are or show us a mirror. And does it mean that stories written in the past, for example, 100 years ago, can actually show us a mirror, and we can see ourselves in those stories written 100 or maybe 200 years ago?
Or maybe 2,500 years ago in the case of Homer or Aeschylus. Yes, absolutely, because the point is that who we are is unchanging. So again, in terms of philosophy, the substance of humanity is unchanging. Accidental aspects like the type of clothes we're wearing or the sort of vehicles we're traveling around in those accidental things change. But the fact we remain, whether Homer's time, Dante's time, Shakespeare's time, our own time, we remain homo viator, homo superbus, and anthropos. It has not changed. So the great literature shows us who we are in that perennial, substantial, essential sense. Whereas works of literature that are up to date, they accentuate the accidental aspects of who we are, will be out of date as soon as those accidental aspects pass away, because accidents are temporary. That which is perennial is permanent. So great literature shows us who we are perennially, permanently.
Let's go to plays, dramas. Should we read them or should we see them in the theater?
That's a great question and a complex one. Again, Shakespeare said all the world's a stage and each must play a part. So what is true of narrative fiction is true of drama. It shows us ourselves, homo viator, man on the journey, man in the story. The problem is that, of course, that plays are meant to be incarnated on the stage through being acted. The problem is, to use the words of T.S. Eliot from his poem The Hollow Men, between the potency and the existence falls the shadow. So between the potency, the power and potential of the original work and its incarnation on the stage, a shadow falls. And that shadow is usually the director or the producer, who can manipulate and distort and pervert a playwright's intentions, so that what's being presented on the stage is a perversion and an inversion of what the playwright actually wrote and intended. This is what I call, in the case of Shakespeare abuse. And really, I'll give you one example, the most egregious. Before I moved to the United States, in England, I saw a performance of The Merchant of Venice, and every single one of the Christian characters in The Merchant of Venice were depicted as a skinhead. And none of the words were changed. Of course, the way they said it was changed. But in between the words, ad-libbing, the skinhead, the Christian characters were spitting at Shylock and kicking him. So here you see an example of, without any words being changed, a director of a play completely and utterly destroying and desecrating Shakespeare's work of beauty into something ugly and agenda-driven.
This is what actually I wanted to ask about, thinking about the same play, and it turns out that it is international, because I saw in the past, I would say, an interpretation, if we can say so, of Shakespeare, because I believe that staging his plays is some sort of interpretation or distortion, yes, of the original play. And it was exactly the same. Christians were shown as a kind of, I don't know, maybe football hooligans or something of that sort in that play. And I think, especially after also reading your books, and I constantly keep thinking about The Merchant of Venice as an example how a play can be distorted on a stage and misinterpreted, misread by a director, for example.
You are correct, of course, that a director is interpreting a play. But, my second book on Shakespeare was called Through Shakespeare's Eyes. And I think that as in all things, we are meant to see things objectively. In other words, we're meant to try to discover the truth in them, not to subject that truth to our own pride and prejudice. So a true interpretation of Shakespeare is to try to understand what Shakespeare's doing in the play, and then being faithful to that. But that means, of course, we have to understand what Shakespeare's doing. So we have to understand Shakespeare. And of course, I don't mind accidental aspects being changed. So for instance, for me, it doesn't matter if Hamlet is set in Napoleonic times or in the 20th century. As we said earlier, The truths in Shakespeare's plays are perennial. The clothes that we wear are accidental, right? So, you know, of course, we have tyrants. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark, says Shakespeare about Hamlet. He's really talking about contemporary turn of the 17th century England, but he could be talking about 1930s Germany. He could be talking about 1917 Russia. You know, he could be talking about any sorts of times, because you know, the secular tyranny, the corruption of Caesar, and the imposition of Caesar's corrupt will on those who are less powerful, it is something which has been going on from time immemorial. So the important thing is, what is Shakespeare doing with Hamlet? And he's showing those timeless lessons about political philosophy, about rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar, but rendering unto God that which is God, being willing to lay down our lives for our friends and country, as Hamlet does. You know, these are perennial lessons. And if we don't interpret the play in that way, we are betraying Shakespeare and abusing his genius. And I would say about the Merchant of Venice, by the way, the Merchant of Venice is Antonio, not Shylock. And Shylock, the trial scene is only visually, the Merchant of Venice is, if you look at the plot line like a piece of string, it has 3 knots, 3 points of focus. The first is the test of the caskets. Shylock's not involved at all. The second is the test of the trial. Shylock and Portia take center stage. The third is the test of the rings. Shylock's not involved at all. The play is not about Shylock. I've sometimes said that the way to look at it, if we were to change the title of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens to Scrooge, nobody would be offended, because A Christmas Carol is about Scrooge. But if you change the title of Oliver Twist to Fagin, right? Everybody said, well, that's bizarre. Basically, you're making a secondary character the main focus. And that's exactly what's being done with the Merchant of Venice. It's not the tragedy of Shylock, it's the comedy of the Merchant of Venice, who is Antonio, and the story surrounding that.
Great. To sum up this, I hope, first part of our conversations online, I would like to ask a final question about readership. Are you worried about polls, surveys that show low readership, show low reading of books? Because personally, I think that 100 books read by Mr. Smith and 100 books read by Mr. Brown is not exactly the same.
I would say, basically, first of all, that we are living in a time of to use the phrase of Oscar Wilde's, the long and not so lovely suicide of the decadent West. In other words, that the ideologies and philosophies of the so-called Enlightenment are unraveling, decaying, decomposing. They're in the process, to use their own terminology, of deconstruction. So we shouldn't be surprised that true civilized values, such as the reading of great books, are in decline at such a time. But all that's necessary is for us to be the seeds, the mustard seeds, to preserve, conserve, and spread and sow those seeds in the culture, so that when the decadent West finally gives up its ghastly ghost, when it dies of its own too muchness, what will be there? What will be there is the resurrection of the church. And as Chesterton says, that the Catholic Church has died on many occasions and been born again because it worships a God and knows the way out of the grave. And honestly, you can look at certain times in history that are at least as bad as the times in which we find ourselves. And if you lived at that time, you'd probably think, well, this is the end. And it wasn't. The end will come, and it could be next week, and it could be next millennium. Not for us to know that. We just have to be good and faithful servants. The end of the world for us is when we die, and that could be tomorrow. So that's the only end of the world we need to worry about, and we have to remain good and faithful servants between now and then.
Thank you, Joseph, for this conversation. Thank you for speaking to me and to my and your viewers.
Pleasure, Jan. Thanks for having me. I would say keep up the great work you're doing there in Poland. You're a source of inspiration for people many, many thousands of miles away. So keep it up.
God bless you.
You too.
Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned. We are already preparing the new episodes of the second series of In a Nutshell about literature with Joseph Pearce. If you like this video and other videos, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a like. And please don't forget to write a comment or a question if you have any. You could also copy the link to this video and post it on other social media. Thank you once again and see you soon. God bless you.